and I'll never go to those train tracks ever again.
Boom! The freaking door on her closet just slammed shut.
I've got some of the strangest stories I've ever found. They're full of dark secrets and events that don't have an explanation. Low-key, I'm just glad I'm not in one of them.
Let me give you guys a story time of when I met this girl at KFC. Randomly, girl decided to come sit with me, and she told me a story of how her dad was abusing her mom and she gave her dad poison. But she didn't go to jail for it because they ruled it as a suicide. So I was at this KFC and I was waiting for my food because I always get takeaway, right? So I'm waiting for my food and this girl comes up to me with her food because she was eating in, and she's like, can I please sit with you, you know, because today is one of those days where she feels her lonely. She's at her loneliest, and she's like, can she please sit with me? I'm like, yeah, sure. She's eating, I'm not. She asked me, am I waiting for my food? Is it going to take long? I'm like, I don't know, but yeah, I'm waiting for it. It's like, no, you should eat in because I'm bored. So cool, I get my order and I just decide to sit down and I start opening the box and I'm talking to her, we're eating, and she's like, today is her dad's birthday and she doesn't know if she should mourn or she just doesn't know how she should feel. And I'm like, why? So she tells me that, you know, my dad was very abusive to my mom, and she's like, how she found this out was that she's the oldest of all her siblings, and every single time they would come back from school, her mom would be ironing clothes. And she's like, her mom only did this when her dad was home, and the reason for this is that her dad like worked like this. 1 week he worked where they stayed, the other week he had to move to another company because his dad was good like that at his job. So she's like, one day she realized that there was a problem because her mom and dad were not speaking for one, and her mom was ironing the duvets. Like, she had ironed the curtains and everything, there was nothing else to iron, and she was ironing like the duvets and all of that, and she was like, something is wrong. And so she used to take time when she came back from school because she would stay with her friends or whatever. So this time she's like, today when school comes out, for some reason, she's like, something was like, today when school comes out, I'm gonna fast walk, I'm gonna go home. Do you understand? Cool, baby girl decides after school, she doesn't even talk with her friends, she leaves and then she speeds walk home. When she gets there, she's from the gate, she can't hear anything, right? She kind of starts tiptoeing for some reason. You know that gut feeling that you have? She gets to the window and she starts listening, and she can hear her mom being like, please, like, why are you hitting me? And she's like, and the dad is like, but why did you take time to go to the shops? Why didn't you come back early? You are probably flirting with men there. She's like, I wasn't flirting with men. I was buying groceries. And boom, boom, boom. I was like, whoa, that is intense. She's like, bro. So she's just like peeking at the window. She can't really see, well, at the window that she was peeking at, and then she went to the other window where she could see because the curtains were open, and she's just watching her dad just beat on her mom like nobody's business. Opens the curtains. After her dad beat on her mom, he opens all the curtains because the curtains were closed. It was just that one curtain that they forgot. You know, people that do bad things and they tried and they cover it up, like, you know what you're doing is wrong, that's why you're closing the curtains, because you know people are going to look at you sideways, but he did it anyways. She's like, after they opened the curtains, she kind of stood and she didn't know what to do, and guess what, her mom started ironing. And she's like, she can see that her mom is crying, and as she cries, the more she cries, the more she irons. So she's like, oh, all this time you're ironing, it's because this man is doing this to you. If she didn't have anything to iron, she says she would wash the clothes. If she didn't have anything to wash, like, she would make a plan so that she can take out all her anger on cleaning, so that her kids come home and they don't see what the dad did to her. And every time the dad was not there, like, her mom was at her happiest. So she's like, every single day she would come back home early just to watch this unfold. Now she's like, one day she decided, no man, it's time I confront these people and I show them that I know that my dad has been abusing my mom. Gandhi, she was opening a can of worms for her dad to now stop hiding the abuse, you know what I mean, to stop hiding the fact that he hits their mom, and started doing it in front of them. At night he was beating on her. When the mom apparently refused to sleep with him, she would beat him, she would beat her up. She's like, yeah, you're tired because you're sleeping with other men. When she was in the house this whole time. So baby girl was like, no man, you know, there's a time when they do groceries at her home, right? And they only go sometimes as just siblings and their mom, and sometimes the dad tags along. She's like, this is the day that the dad was staying and it was just the mom as well as the siblings. She's like, that's when she thought she was gonna do it. I'm like, girl. So her dad was somebody that also struggled with sleep, right? cool. She decided to give her dad his sleeping tablets before they left to go to the mall. And obviously when he gave her the sleeping tablets, she says she made the tea that she gave her dad with poison. But I'm like, the poison was gonna show inside the tea, don't you think? And she's like, no, like at her house they had these boba thingies, I don't know what they call them, and they used to make boba tea or sometimes make milkshakes with boba inside. So I'm like, oh. And she's like, yes. She put chia seeds and then she put the poison. She put like a little bit of chia seeds and then she put like a lot of poison inside, and then she put boba thingies inside. And her dad thought like, and then she told her dad that I mixed this with chia seeds, it's good for you, la 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 la. And then, mind you, this man had drank sleeping pills, right? Gives him the tea, and they leave. She's like watching from the door to make sure that he drinks the tea, right? So she's standing there just watching, and he's just going in on the tea, and it's like, this is kind, and he was like, this is kind of like, what is this? It's kind of like it's got a little tang to it. She's like, it's probably because of the chia seeds, whatever. And the dad drank the tea. After that, she now that she sees that baby boy is actually drinking the tea without failure, she locks the door, goes inside the car, they go buy their whatevers, and when they came back, guess what? They came back and they found the man unconscious. Girl. I'm like, yo, like, didn't you feel guilty? She's like, no. After it happened, obviously the police got called, and she's like, the only time she felt guilty actually was when the police came and she thought they're gonna be like, maybe there's some foul play. And they asked, like, what happened? She's like, I gave him tea, and then she took out the chia seeds as well as the boba. She's like, this is what he drank, you know what I mean? And then he drank his sleeping pills, and she was like crying, and then she went out, and then eventually they ruled it as a suicide. And she's like, after that she kind of had like some sort of relief. I'm like, yeah. So she's like, the only reason she doesn't feel guilty is because the things that she used to see this man do to her mom were just enraging. Like, they would make you. She's like, at some point her dad stabbed her mom like near death type vibes, and she had to nurse her mom. She had to see her mom lose breath and come back to life again because she was not allowed to she was not allowed to go to school, and her mom was not allowed to go to the hospital because he feared that he was going to go to jail, and he didn't want people knowing what was happening in the house. So she was not allowed to go to school. She had to nurse her mom. So she was just like, he had to go. And she's like, eventually she did tell her mom what had happened, and her mom was like, I knew what you did. I saw what you were doing. I know what you did, and I let you do it because I knew that if you don't do that, I'm never going to leave this man, and he's going to kill me one day. You know what I mean? So she was like, I know. I just kept quiet. And yeah, from that day she's been living her life, but now she's obviously starting to need her dad, and I feel like she was kind of starting to regret it, because, you know, she was like, so today is his birthday and I don't want to go to his grave because I know what I did. At the same time, like, I need my dad and I'm the one, la la la. I'm like, bro, so nobody suspects that what you did? She's like, nope, nobody suspects any foul play. She goes to her dad's house, her dad's family, to go visit. They treat her well. She goes to her mom's family. Like, nothing is different, nothing. But at the end of the day, like, she only feels guilty that she's mourning him now, you know what I mean? And I'm just like, I don't know, y'all, what do you think? Like, do you think what she did was right? I mean, he was, like, I don't know, y'all.
Thinking about those chia seeds and the boba pearls floating in that tea is actually making me feel lightheaded. She was so calm about every bit of it. The fact that her mom watched her do it and didn't move a muscle to stop her says everything about how bad life was in that house. That total silence in the kitchen while he drank is just way too hard for me. It's like they were in this together without saying a single word out loud. Now she's just eating there at dinner with his family, holding onto this massive secret while they talk about how much they really miss him.
This story comes from Anonymous. Hey Savannah, I have a story about the Appalachian Mountains if you would like to hear it. I've always been taught if you see something, no you didn't, and if you hear something, no you didn't. But I will say that curiosity got the best of me this night, and I've been really paranoid ever since. Let me set the scene of what happened that night. I was 18, freshly out of high school, when a group of my friends and I got together to hang out. Of course, being so young, we thought we were invincible and it didn't matter what we did or where we went. There were 4 of us, and we decided to go to a nearby train track in our town and walk down it at night. It was the local legend that if you walk down the tracks by yourself at night with no light, that a man in a conductor's uniform and hat would stop you and tell you to turn around. Of course we knew this wasn't true, but we really didn't have anything better going on, so to the train tracks we went. When we showed up, it was pitch black outside and you really couldn't see much. We pulled out our phones and turned on our flashlights. We had to walk a little bit down this road to get to the train tracks. We were all talking, trying to decide who was going to be the first one to walk down the tracks by themselves. Eventually, everyone in the group landed on me and said that I should be the first one to go since I really didn't think the legend was true. I agreed and said that I would go first. We finally got to the train tracks and I stepped into the middle and looked back at my friends. They were all smiling and laughing, telling me to go for it, but I started to feel really uneasy. I found enough courage to start walking, but told myself I wouldn't go that far and I would come back and let somebody else go. I'm walking for maybe 2 minutes when I turn around to look back at my friends, but I didn't see them. I hadn't even gone that far because I could still see the road they were supposed to be standing on. I called out to them, but they didn't reply. I told them to knock it off and that it wasn't funny, but I still didn't hear or see anything. I turned around to see if maybe they had snuck by me through the woods to get behind me to try to scare me, but there was nobody there. At this point, I'm really freaked out, so I turn back around to start walking back to where my friends were supposed to be. I take a few steps and I hear my name being called from behind me. I instantly turn around thinking, of course, this was one of my friends trying to prank me, but when I turned around, I see a man standing behind me, about 6 foot tall, wearing a conductor's uniform and hat. I instantly felt sick, but then the man lifted up his hand and pointed his finger behind me and said, "Turn around and go back." The man didn't have to tell me twice. I turned around and booked it back to the car. As I'm running back to the car, I feel like I'm being chased. I turned my head to look over my shoulder and I could still see the man standing there in the same spot. I finally make it back and my friends are all there sitting in the car. I jumped in the driver's seat, slammed and locked the door, and look over at my friends. They are all clearly freaked out, asking me what happened. Before I could even answer that question, I start yelling at them because they left me out there by myself and that definitely wasn't the plan. That's when my friend sitting next to me in the front seat interrupted me and said, "Why did you keep walking when we told you to stop and come back?" I told him that he most certainly did not tell me to come back and that I didn't hear them say anything. He told me that they were screaming my name, telling me to come back because they saw something in the woods walking towards me. He said it looked like a tall shadow figure that had white, glowing eyes. When he told me that, I got chills all over my body. I just stared at them for a minute, and then I told them that when I had turned around and saw that they weren't there anymore and turned back around to see if they were behind me, that's when I saw the man in the conductor's uniform. Every one of my friends just stared at me. One of my friends in the back seat said, "Be for real and tell us what you saw." I turned around and looked at them with all seriousness and told them that I saw the man in the conductor's uniform with the conductor's hat, and he told me to turn around and go back. All of us were freaked out beyond belief, so I started the car and started to head back home. I'm really not sure what I saw, and I've tried to rationally explain it, but I can't. A few days later, one of my friends that was sitting in the back seat told me about one of his theories. He said he wonders if the man on the train tracks wearing the conductor's uniform stands there to tell people to turn around and go back, so they don't stumble upon the shadow figure with wide eyes. All I can say is whatever we encountered there that night is something I never want to come across again. I know this probably sounds hard to believe, and trust me, had it not happened to me, I would probably feel the same way. But I can promise you that I believe in the legend now, and I'll never go to those train tracks ever again. So I don't know about you, but I'm kinda scared of train tracks now. And listen, I totally get being in a small town and not really having a lot to do, so you kind of make up your own fun. But if I would have heard about a legend talking about a man being on the train tracks in a conductor's uniform and hat, telling you to turn around and go back, I think I would have come up with something different to do that night. But that's just me. So I do want to say that I'm in agreement with the friend from the back seat talking about the conductor standing there telling you to turn around and go back. I'm thinking that he actually is there telling you to turn around and go back so you don't stumble across the shadow figure with white eyes. I mean, that does sound pretty logical to me, so you guys let me know in the comments what you think.
I'm completely on the edge after hearing about that ghost conductor suddenly appearing out of thin air. Sounds like he was honestly trying to protect her from something much worse. That shadow figure with the white glowing eyes sounds like that'll keep you awake all night. I'd be running so fast, I'd leave my shoes behind. It's not one thing to hear a legend, but another experience entirely to have it talk to you. Most spirits just linger, but this guy gave a clear warning. That's what stays in mind. He was just wanting to be helpful. I'm going to be careful before walking near train tracks now.
This girl emailed me and said that her house was so haunted that they had to have a paranormal team come in to investigate, and the paranormal team ended up leaving. We're gonna call this girl Casey for the story. So all of Casey's life, she's been able to see and hear things. This is not odd for her, but this experience that she had in this house will be with her forever, she said. When she was younger, her and her family moved into a small town in Texas, and they had just moved into this house. It was about 105 years old when they first moved in, and this was in 2013. So everything was normal for about a week after they moved in, but after a week passed is when things started to ramp up. So they would start losing things. Like they would put an object somewhere and then it would just end up somewhere else out of nowhere, or things would be knocked over when no one was near them. Her family did try to rationalize this and ignore it, but this became extremely difficult to do when things got much worse. One day they're all going out to eat with their grandmother. They go out to eat, they have a good time, they come home, they open the door, they go to walk in the house, and they stop dead in their tracks because right in front of them on the floor, written in red lipstick from the 1940s, is the word leave. I'm assuming that the reason that she knew that this lipstick was from the 1940s is because it was sitting right next to the writing. No one in the family owned this lipstick. This really freaks them out, but there's nothing that they can really do about it, so they choose to ignore it. Well, later on that night, she's getting ready for bed. She goes to bed, she falls asleep, and she wakes up in the middle of the night. She has no idea why she woke up, but she finds herself staring at her closet, and she doesn't really understand why she's staring at her closet, but she gets this inkling that she needs to get up and she needs to go open the closet door. So she gets up out of bed, she walks over to the door, and she slowly opens the door, not really expecting to see anything, just opening the door to have it open, right? As she opens the door, she's looking straight at something. It's this little girl, and she looks kind of misty, and she didn't move and she didn't say anything, but her face looked like a little girl, but it did not have the face of a little girl. She said she had these gray eyes and this huge smile on her face, and she could see all of her teeth, and this smile was just creepy. Out of fear, she looks away for a second, and then she looks back into the closet, and it was just gone. She at this point is like, okay, this is my imagination. There's like shadows in the closet that are playing tricks on me. I am going back to bed. So she goes and she runs back to her bed. She somehow falls asleep. She doesn't know how, but she did. Now, the next part of the story, she does not remember herself, and she doesn't know why she doesn't remember this, but her parents, this is coming from her parents' perspective. A few days later, her mom and her dad are lying in their bed in their room that is next to her room, and they're watching TV. When all of a sudden they hear this really loud thud, and it's followed by something that sounds like something shattered. Then they suddenly hear their daughter make this whining, like cry noise, and so they run into their daughter's room, and Casey is just sitting in the middle of the floor next to the closet. They look up at the ceiling and they see that her chandelier is swaying back and forth from her bed to her closet. She said that her ceiling was 10 feet high. So Casey's mom is like, "What happened, Casey?" And Casey just looks up at the chandelier and goes, "I hit it." Her mom is kind of like, "You hit it like with a toy?" And Casey's like, "No, I hit it with my head." And her mom just kind of looks over at her dad, super confused, and then looks back over at Casey and realizes that Casey has a red mark on her head. So somehow, Casey had lifted 10 feet off of the ground and hit her head on the chandelier when she was alone in her room by herself. Things just ended up getting worse from here, right? So her mom one day is walking down the hallway, and she looks up at the vent that's in the hallway, and there is something coming out of the vent that is connected to Casey's closet. Now, she didn't say exactly what this was, but this was the tipping point for them that they were finally like, you know what, we have to get somebody in here to come help us because something is going on here that is not normal. So a couple days later, the paranormal team comes in and they set up all of their stuff, and they set it up in Casey's room because that's where everything is happening. They set up cameras, a video recording, and a voice recording. Casey said that everybody in the room was talking to whatever this thing was, trying to get it to respond in some way. And it's not responding, right, at first. And they keep talking to it. They're kind of antagonizing it when boom, the freaking door on her closet just slammed shut. She said that after that, the paranormal team just left. Thanks, guys. Like, you're there to do your job. She said that after the paranormal team left, they ended up staying there for 2 more months where things would get ultimately worse, so bad that they would end up having to move out of the house. She said that one day her dad was in the bathroom and that he had kept the door open while he was going to the bathroom, and her mom was in the room, like it was the bathroom connected to their room, and he got up and all of a sudden the TV just drained of power completely, and then it turned back on, and then all this static just came on the screen. So they're both just staring at this TV like, what the hell's going on, when all of a sudden a pair of her father's steel-toed boots come flying at him and narrowly miss him. She said that the last thing that happened that was really like the icing on the cake was that her dad was getting ready for work one day, and he went to go walk out the front door, and the kitchen was kind of behind where the front door was, and as he's walking out the door, a sharp, shiny object comes flying, barely missed his head, and just slams into the door frame and sticks into the door frame. She said that about a week later that they moved, and that she still actually has things happen, but they're not nearly as bad. So what did you guys think of the story? That's pretty creepy. First of all, I can't believe that the paranormal team just left like that. Like a door shutting. That's crazy. I mean, I would understand if any of the other things happened while the paranormal team was there, especially the last thing that happened. Like if they were like, okay, this isn't safe, we have to leave, because that's not safe at that point. But just to leave because a door slams is pretty crazy to me. But what do you guys think was in this house? What do you think that this was? Because whatever this was has a ton of energy, because it was able to literally pick her up 10 feet off of the ground and make her hit her head on that chandelier. So that's crazy. And the energy to like pick objects up like that and throw them, it always makes me wonder, do they miss on purpose, or do you think that they are not allowed to actually like physically harm? Because you always hear these stories of like objects being thrown at people but it missing them and not actually hitting them. So it makes me wonder if at some point there's an intervention, a divine intervention.
Casey opening that bedroom door and seeing a girl with a huge toothy smile is enough to make anyone move out. Most people just don't go back to sleep after noticing something like that. Things get serious when her parents found her sitting on the floor after hitting her head with this 10-foot high chandelier. Hitting your head that high up in the air means something picked you up. I'm stuck wondering how that girl seen and why she was acting that way. It strikes me she was crouching there for Casey to look. Picturing something lurking in a dark closet for you is overwhelming.
Has the case of Elisa Lam been solved, or is there more to it? Now, this case is extremely famous. It has gone viral multiple times all over the internet, and Netflix also did a documentary on it. And most people seem to believe that it has been solved, and unfortunately it was just a very bad set of circumstances that ultimately led to a freak accident. But some people believe that maybe there is more to it. So the story takes place in Los Angeles, specifically at this hotel here called the Hotel Cecil. And this hotel has a very long history, and it's not all good. The hotel has been known to be home to a lot of violence, gruesome crimes, and multiple people taking their own lives. Even Richard Ramirez, aka the Night Stalker, once called the Cecil Hotel home for a short amount of time. But then in 2013, we meet Elisa Lam, and she was a Canadian university student. Now, it is important to note that Elisa was suffering from mental illness. She did have an extensive history dealing with it. And sometimes she was known for not taking her medication, which resulted in her being hospitalized at least one time in the past. But in January of 2013, she made a decision to go visit Los Angeles. She arrived on the 26th of January and 2 days later checked into the Cecil Hotel. Now, initially she had booked a room where she would be sharing with a few different roommates, but very quickly after she checked in, these roommates started complaining of very bizarre behavior coming from her, which resulted in Elisa being moved into her own room. Now, throughout her trip, she was keeping in contact with her family, except on January 31st, that contact stopped. And when her parents did not hear from her for an extended period of time, they became extremely worried. This was out of character for Elisa, so they decided to report her as missing. The police arrived to the hotel and searched it as much as they legally could at the time without completely disrupting everyone's stay, but there was no sign of Elisa anywhere. About a week later, the search was intensified even more, with the LAPD sharing her flyer all over the city. Then a week after that, on February 13th, LAPD decided that they needed to release the last known video footage of Elisa. And this was the footage that made the case go absolutely viral. And it was because of how odd Elisa's behavior was when this was taken. Now, this video footage was taken on January 31st, the last known day that Elisa was seen alive. And in the video footage, you can see her frantically running into the elevator, almost as if she was being chased by someone. But if she was being chased by someone, that person never appeared on the video. She runs into the elevator and is obviously very panicked, like she's freaking out, and she even starts pressing almost every button possible. At one point, she starts peeking out of the elevator to see if anyone else is in the hallway. And eventually she walks out of the elevator as the doors close behind her. And immediately the theories were swirling all over the internet. One of them being obviously that she was maybe being chased by someone, while others suggested that maybe she was under the influence of some sort of substance. But when the news came out that she was suffering from mental illness, a lot of people thought that maybe she was suffering from some sort of episode. Then about mid-February, while the search for Elisa was still ongoing, a lot of the people staying at the hotel started to complain about the water. They were saying that the water now had some sort of weird taste and almost appeared to be a black, muddy color. And that was when maintenance workers went upstairs to the roof of the hotel to check on the water supply. And when they opened the tank, that was when they made the horrifying discovery that Elisa was inside one of these tanks face up. And unfortunately, she was no longer alive. And essentially what people were describing in the water was a result of her body decomposing inside of the tank. An autopsy was done on Elisa's body, and it revealed that there was no sign of physical trauma or SA. They did find some traces of prescribed medication as well as ibuprofen, but there were no signs of any illegal substances. But even more alarming to the public was how she could have possibly even gotten into the tank in the first place. Supposedly the doors and the stairs leading to the roof are completely locked and only accessible with staff passkeys. And even if she was able to somehow get through these doors, it would have triggered an alarm. Some suggest that maybe she used the fire escape to make her way to the roof, but that still leaves up for debate as to how she managed to even get inside the tank. Mainly because these tanks did not have any sort of attached ladder to them, and the lid for them were also very heavy. Now, common sense would tell you that Elisa could have potentially been suffering from some sort of manic episode, considering that she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and somehow made her way to the roof, pushed the lid open, and jumped in and unfortunately drowned. But that theory just does not seem like enough of an explanation for a lot of people out there, with many choosing to believe that there was something much more nefarious going on here, especially when you watch the video. And some people even seem to believe that there is some sort of paranormal element involved. But like always, let me know what you guys think. The story of Rebecca Zahau is just one of those cases that does not sit right with me and a lot of other people. Because although authorities seem to believe that she decided to take her own life, there are a lot of strange things in the case that just do not add up. Not to mention that her friends and family do not believe that she would ever choose to do that to herself. But let's go back to the beginning. So Rebecca was born in Burma. Eventually she ended up moving to Nepal, then Germany, before she moved to the United States. In 2008, she began dating this man here. His name was Jonah Shakne, and he was the CEO of a medical pharmaceutical company. And he also had 3 children from his past 2 marriages. But then in 2011, tragedy struck. Now the couple was living in California at the time. Rebecca was at home with Jonah's youngest son, and she was also there with her teenage sister. Rebecca would later claim that she was in the bathroom and Max was left unattended for a very short amount of time. And during that time, Max somehow fell over the banister over the stairs and suffered some serious injuries. Rebecca's sister called 911 right away, but unfortunately, little Max did not make it. His injuries were just way too much for him to handle. A few weeks later, Max's passing away was ruled as an accident. However, one of the doctors that examined Max at the hospital before he passed away said that it seemed like this was not an accident, almost like he had been suffocated before he fell. But again, ultimately, it was ruled an accident, suggesting that he somehow tripped. But before all of that was revealed, something else happened to Rebecca. So the day after Max passed away, it was July 12th. Now that day, Rebecca dropped off her sister at the airport to catch her flight home. But that same day, she was also picking up Jonah's brother Adam from the airport. Later that evening, the three of them plus a friend named Howard all had dinner together. But after dinner, Jonah would go back to the hospital to spend the evening with his son and his ex-wife. And later that evening, reports came from neighbors that there was a lot of loud music happening at the home. And then the next morning, on July 13th at approximately 6:45 a.m., Jonah's brother Adam said that he found Rebecca hanging from the outside balcony. He also said that she was completely undressed, had her hands tied behind her back, and her ankles had also been bound. And this was the balcony where Rebecca was found by Adam. A few minutes later, he called 911, and he also said that he had cut her down from the balcony. He had also texted his brother right away to tell him what had happened. The medics arrived to the scene fairly quickly, but unfortunately, she had already passed away. There was nothing they could do about it. But almost right away, whispers started swirling that maybe foul play was involved here. However, there was no trace of DNA from anyone except Rebecca, which resulted in her passing being ruled as her choosing to end her own life. But during her autopsy, there was some strange information revealed. She had 4 wounds to her head. Now, the main theory to explain this was that when she jumped, the swinging of her body weight could have resulted in her head slamming against the balcony. However, it would have been very unlikely for this to have happened 4 times, hard enough for her to sustain injuries. Obviously, her family was not convinced that Rebecca did this to herself, so they requested a second autopsy to be done. And this time, the coroner suggested that manual strangulation was involved and that she did not do this to herself. And he also included evidence suggesting that Rebecca had been SA'd before she passed away. There was also a ton of doubt surrounding the idea as to whether or not she would have been able to tie her ankles and her wrists together before jumping off. But there was one more piece of evidence that was very bizarre. A message had been spray painted on the door of the bedroom leading to the balcony, and it read, "She saved him, can he save her?" And to this day, no one has any idea what that message meant. Now, Rebecca's family was still adamant throughout the entire time that she did not do this, and they actually put pressure on the authorities to focus on Jonah's brother Adam. And they even filed a civil lawsuit against him, claiming that he was responsible for Rebecca's passing, which they ended up winning, but he quickly appealed the decision. And in 2019, both parties decided to settle. And to this day, the reason behind Rebecca's passing has been a huge topic of debate. Some people believe that she did it out of extreme guilt for having had that accident happen under her watch. Some say that she probably felt extremely guilty and responsible for Max's passing, while others believe that maybe she was taken out as a punishment for not being more careful while watching Max.
The message painted right on the door is the detail I keep mulling over. She saved him, can he save her? What does that even mean? It feels like some kind of cruel riddle left behind for everyone to find. Next you watch Elisa in that elevator, and it's just a lot to take in. She's hiding from something we simply can't see on the tape. The way she presses all those buttons makes my heart sink, because she looks so desperate for an escape. How did she get onto that roof without an alarm going off? I'm definitely going to keep my lights on for a while after this one.
On Sunday afternoon, March 12, 2006, 39-year-old Michael Zamiti Jr. drove his ATV across a frozen lake in Freedom, New Hampshire. And even though it was really cold and the air burned his cheeks and his lungs, Mike smiled as he drove. He really just loved it here. Most of the time, Mike lived 2 hours away in the town of Wakefield, Massachusetts. But he'd been coming to Freedom, New Hampshire for years because his parents had a vacation house here. And so this tiny lakeside community had always felt like a second home and a peaceful retreat. And Mike had recently bought his own vacation house in Freedom just down the street from his parents. And the purchase had been a really big deal for him. He ran a cement contracting company called Allstate Concrete Pumping, and he'd worked really hard for many years to build up a nice life for his wife Michelle and their 3 kids. And in many ways, the purchase of the second house was proof that he'd done it. But his work with the concrete company had also created some issues in his marriage. Being in charge of a company meant a lot of responsibility and long hours. So Michelle and the kids were on their own quite a bit, which meant Michelle had to do most of the parenting and most of the household stuff. And she'd recently made it clear that Mike being gone all the time, despite how successful he was still really hard on her. Now, out on the lake, as Mike was kind of thinking about his whole life, Mike could see another ATV coming toward him. And as it got closer, he could see that the driver of the ATV was the other problem in his marriage: Sean Fitzpatrick. So Sean was one of their neighbors on the lake, and he'd been a close friend of the family for years. He was retired, and he lived in Freedom year-round, and when the Zimitis were there, he'd come over for dinners or barbecues or to take their kids boating out on the lake. He was around so much that Mike's kids actually called him Uncle Sean. But last summer, Mike had found out that his wife Michelle had cheated on him with Sean. Mike had been obviously completely devastated, but he and Michelle had both agreed not to give up on their marriage and had been going to therapy together ever since. And in terms of Mike and Sean's relationship, well, Mike still hadn't actually spoken to Sean since finding out about the affair, because mostly he just hated confrontation. It had been easier for him to avoid Sean and focus on rebuilding his relationship with Michelle. So seeing Sean now made Mike want to just turn around and speed off in the other direction. But Mike could see that Sean was already waving him down, so he came to a stop and waited there as Sean pulled his ATV up. And Sean did not beat around the bush. He immediately told Mike that he was glad he ran into him here because he'd been wanting to apologize about last summer and Michelle. It obviously wasn't okay, and he hoped they could just, put it behind them. And Mike, he was so surprised by how sincere Sean was being that he just said, "You know what, it's all good." Which he didn't mean, because it definitely was not okay. But again, Mike's not a confrontational guy. All Mike really wanted to do here was get out of this interaction and get away from Sean, because this made him really uncomfortable. And also, he genuinely did need to leave basically right now, because he and Michelle and the kids were getting ready to head back to Wakefield soon, and he wanted to go help Michelle pack up. And so pretty quickly, Mike told Sean that he really had to go here. And then before, Sean could protest, Mike turned his ATV around and he gunned it back across the lake towards his house. About 15 minutes later, Mike walked into his house, and the first thing he saw was a bunch of suitcases all packed and sitting by the door. And he realized that, Michelle had already done all the work. But seconds later, Michelle came in and gave Mike a kiss. And she said, the kids were just finishing up cleaning their rooms and they could all head out in a few minutes. And then Mike heard the sound of a car beeping twice outside. And when he and his wife heard that, Michelle kind of rolled her eyes and laughed, because they both knew it was clearly Mike's parents. His parents had also been in Freedom for this weekend at their house down the street, and they were also making the 2-hour drive back to Wakefield this afternoon. And Michelle was laughing because it amused her that neither Mike nor his father could manage to go a single day without talking to each other. So Mike's dad was also named Michael, and the name was not the only thing they shared. They were also best friends and co-workers. Michael Sr. owned the company that Mike ran, Allstate Concrete. So it was like a family operation, and Mike Jr. had never even thought of doing anything else. He jumped into the concrete business right out of high school, and he and his dad had been working together ever since. Now, the Allstate Concrete Company had some struggles, just like any company would, including a lawsuit from a former employee that had been pretty stressful. But for the most part, the business was a huge success, and right now they were busier than ever, working on an enormous construction project in nearby Boston. So Mike headed outside to say hi to his parents and to talk a little business with his dad. He asked Mike Sr. if he'd called their employee, Chester Roberts, yet, because Mike and his dad had plans to be at the office first thing tomorrow morning, and Mike wanted Chester to be there too. Chester worked part-time for them as a driver and also handyman, and he was easily the most reliable employee that they had. So whenever they had a packed week ahead, they always called Chester in. And to Mike Jr.'s relief, Mike Sr. said yes, he'd already spoken to Chester, and they were good to go. So eventually, they all said their goodbyes, and Mike Jr. told his dad he would see him tomorrow. Just before 8 a.m. the next morning, Monday, March 13th, Mike Jr. pulled his truck into the parking lot of Allstate Concrete. He was right on time. He could see he was the first vehicle there, so he got out and hustled across the lot because it was raining, and he unlocked a side door by one of the garage doors. So the Allstate building was basically just a massive garage with 3 huge roll-up doors for their cement trucks to pull into. But it also had an upstairs office where Mike and his father did all their administrative work. And so after Mike went in through the side door into the big garage, he headed up a set of steps that led to his office on the second level. And when he got there, he sat in his desk chair and started going over the week's logistics. And just a few minutes later, he heard another vehicle pull into the lot outside. Mike figured that very likely this was his father, because Chester often came to the office on foot. Then Mike Jr. heard the downstairs door open and footsteps coming up the stairs. A few minutes later, Mike's father, Mike Sr., pulled his truck into the Allstate Concrete parking lot and parked next to his son's truck. He hopped out and walked quickly to the building's side door to get out of the rain, but when he tried to push open the side door, it got stuck on something and wouldn't open all the way. So he looked through the crack to see what was blocking the door, and he froze, because there was clearly a man lying face down inside of the building in a huge pool of blood. Now, it was dark inside the building, and so Michael Sr. could not see the man's face. He had no idea who this guy was. But whoever it was, he knew sort of instinctively that it was not his son. Mike Jr. was a big guy, and even in the dark, it was clear this man had a different build. And so Michael Sr.'s heart was pounding now, and all he could think to do was just back away, grab his cell phone, and call 911. However, after Michael Sr. got off the phone with the dispatcher and they said they were sending people over now, Mike Sr. realized he couldn't just wait for the police to get there. I mean, there was clearly someone either very badly hurt or dead in his garage, and his son was likely somewhere inside too. I mean, his truck was here, and so he had to go in and make sure his son was okay. So Michael Sr. walked away from the blocked door where he had been standing when he called the police, and he pulled up one of the big roll-up garage doors. And once it was open, he didn't see anyone. He just ran inside and began frantically screaming his son's name. But Mike Jr. didn't answer, and there was no sign of him anywhere. So eventually, Mike Sr. ran to the staircase and went up to the second-floor office. And as soon as Mike Sr. barged into the office, he stopped in horror. Because there, sitting slumped in the desk chair, was the blood-covered body of his son. Over an hour later, Massachusetts State Trooper Kevin Baker pulled up in front of Allstate Concrete. He could see the large building was already roped off with caution tape, and there were a dozen or more crime scene techs and officers with the Wakefield Police Department who were moving in and out of an open garage door collecting evidence. So Baker was not a part of the Wakefield Police Department. He was with the state police. But in Massachusetts, state troopers conduct homicide investigations right alongside local authorities. And Baker had a feeling that this case would definitely need his help. Because Wakefield, they didn't get many homicides. The town was about 10 miles north of Boston and had a reputation as being a really peaceful and safe place. The kind of small town where everyone actually knew each other. Baker got out of his cruiser and looked around for whoever was in charge. And he didn't have to wait long, because an officer hurried up to him and introduced himself as Detective Richard Cass with the Wakefield Police Department. Cass told Baker to follow him, and as they walked towards the open garage door, he quickly briefed Baker up on the situation. There were 2 male victims inside, and both were deceased. They'd both been shot, and they had been found by the company's owner, Michael Zametti Sr., a little after 8 a.m. Baker followed Cass into the garage and over to the first body, which was face down on the floor just inside a smaller side door. Cass explained that this victim was 51-year-old Chester Roberts, a part-time truck driver for Allstate. It hadn't been difficult to identify him because Chester did a lot of handiwork around town and was known by all the locals, including Detective Cass himself. When Baker went to the body, he could tell right away that Chester had been shot in the back. It was a single shot and most likely was from a shotgun, since clearly there was a blast radius where there was like a spray effect with a lot of little pellets that entered his body. Chester had no other visible injuries, including no defensive injuries. And when Baker stood and looked around the garage, he also didn't see anything that pointed to a robbery or any kind of struggle. There was pretty pricey looking equipment just sitting around, and nothing was toppled over or obviously out of place. So Baker guessed that Chester's killer had likely snuck up on him and shot him in the back before he even had a chance to turn around. Baker spent a couple more minutes looking around at the doors and the windows, and again, didn't see any signs of, forced entry or anything out of the ordinary, but that didn't mean much. Chester had likely opened up for the day and begun work, and the killer had just come in after him. And so after a few minutes, when Baker was done looking around the first floor, he told Cass he was ready to go up to the second floor to see the second body. Moments later, Cass led Baker into the second floor office, where the body of 39-year-old Mike Zametti Jr. had been found. Detective Cass said sadly that, just like with Chester, he knew Mike personally as well. Mike Jr. had not just been shot in the torso the way Chester had been shot. He had been shot in the face as well as in the chest. And the force of these shots had been so powerful that, like, his desk and surrounding paperwork were also all drenched in blood. And for the most part, Mike was basically unrecognizable. But what struck Baker the most was not just how gruesome this was. It was the fact that, Mike Jr. is still kind of slumped in his chair. He's in his office. whoever did this, it's like they went in here to execute Mike, really intentionally. They marched in here, they didn't touch anything else, and they shot Mike right in the face with a shotgun before Mike could even get up. I mean, this seemed very intentional. Somebody came here to kill Mike. And so as Baker was thinking about that, he realized that this likely meant Mike Jr. was the one who actually got shot first, before Chester had even arrived at the building. Otherwise, Mike Jr. would have heard the gunshot downstairs, and he wouldn't have been so caught off guard sitting in his chair like this. And so again, if Mike was the first person shot, it just further suggested that he was the main target of this attack. The crime scene, of course was gruesome, but considering it was remarkably clean. I mean, there were no bloody footprints or any indication the killer had interacted with the scene. And the Zamitis did fit the mafia stereotype, an Italian-American family involved in construction. Baker told Cass what he was thinking, sort of as he was surveying the scene here. And Cass, as he heard this, he sort of had this thoughtful look come over his face. He said he knew the Zamitis pretty well, and Mike Jr. and his father were really good people. So he found it hard to believe they were involved in any kind of shady, mafia business deals. But he conceded that it was possible, especially since the Zamitis were contractors on a project called the Big Dig. And this made Baker immediately raise his eyebrows. So the Big Dig was literally the biggest construction project in the country and involved building a tunnel under the harbor in Boston. But it had been kind of like a total disaster, just a major headache for the city since it was way over budget and had been going on for 15 years and still wasn't done. This huge project had also been famously hampered by mafia dealings and corrupt payoffs. So now Baker had to wonder if the Zamitis had either been involved in these seedy deals or had maybe accidentally upset the wrong person while on the job. But even if the murders had nothing to do with the mob, Baker still thought it was very likely that the killer was somehow connected to their business. Somebody who maybe had worked at Allstate Concrete, or maybe who had been a client, and would know where Mike worked in the building, and that he'd be there early in the morning. And while the second victim, Chester, was probably not the primary target, Baker wasn't sure yet why he was also killed. He could have been killed because he was just at work at the wrong moment, or maybe he was wrapped up in the same conflict as the Zamitis. So for a moment, Baker just stood there staring at the scene, staring at the blood-soaked paperwork all over the desk. And then eventually he turned to Cass and said they would need a list of all of Allstate's employees and clients. Baker then spent some more time just kind of walking around the office looking for evidence, and he noticed a 16-gauge shotgun shell on the floor. So he grabbed a nearby tech and told her to bag it and see if she could locate any other shells. Baker and Cass then headed outside, where already a crowd of people were gathering outside around the outside of the police perimeter. Once they were outside, Trooper Baker asked Cass if they could start by speaking with the person who actually discovered the bodies, Michael Zametti Sr. But Detective Cass shook his head and said no. He explained when he'd first gotten to the scene that Michael Sr. had been so distraught over his son's death that he could barely speak, so Cass had just sent him home. Another Wakefield police officer had done the same thing when Mike Jr.'s wife, Michelle Zametti, showed up, totally hysterical, saying she had heard there was an accident, and they had told her that her husband was dead and taken her home too. Baker understood, but was not thrilled to hear this. He preferred to speak to witnesses and family really quickly and in person. In a murder, a spouse is always a suspect, so he was especially disappointed to have missed Michelle. But there was still plenty to do at the scene, and obviously the Wakefield police knew where the family could be found later. So Baker turned to Cass and suggested they just start canvassing the businesses nearby. The following morning, March 14th, Trooper Baker parked his car in front of Mike's parents' house in Wakefield. He was with Detective Cass, and they were there to speak with Mike Sr. They'd just gotten the autopsies back for both Chester and Mike, but they didn't reveal anything that they didn't already know. Chester had been shot once, Mike twice, and both died likely within seconds. But the investigators did have one potential lead from their canvass of the neighborhood. Even though they hadn't found any surveillance cameras at Allstate Concrete, some businesses around Allstate had some. So Baker had some officers scrubbing through that footage now. He also had another team interviewing Chester Roberts' family, because there was still a chance that Baker had gotten this all wrong and maybe Chester was actually the target. Besides that, the crime techs had not found much physical evidence at the scene. There were no fingerprints, and since it had been raining, they hadn't been able to collect any footprints or car tracks from outside. So now, Baker reached up and knocked on the front door of the Smitty's house, hoping that Mike Sr. would be able to point them in the right direction. A minute later, Baker and Cass sat in the living room with Mike Sr. and Pat, Mike's mom. Both of Mike's parents seemed incredibly emotional. Michael Sr. was visibly shaking, while Pat just cried. And seeing how upset they were now made Baker realize that Cass had made the right call in sending Michael Sr. home yesterday. Even 24 hours later, it was still going to be very hard to get any sort of real answer out of them because of how upset they were. So Baker decided he would just have to keep it really brief. The first thing he did is he asked Mike Sr. to just go over the actual discovery of the bodies. Tell me what happened. And what he said lined up with everything that Baker had heard from Cass and from dispatch. And so after Mike Sr. went over that, Baker moved on to the real reason he was there. He asked if there was anybody in Mike Jr.'s life who might have wanted to hurt him. Mike Sr. took a few shaky breaths as he thought about the question, and then he said that, there were a few people in the industry that he and his son did not necessarily get along with, but mostly they tried to have good relationships with everyone. Getting in fights was just bad business. But as he was saying this, Mike Sr. suddenly sat up straighter, like he just thought of something. And he said, actually, there was a former coworker who did definitely have a grudge against them. His nephew, Hank Jennings. Hank got mad at them a few years ago about unpaid overtime wages and actually filed a lawsuit against them. Now, they'd eventually paid Hank a settlement, but they still all hated each other. Mike Sr. looked over at his wife, Pat, and she just nodded and said the whole thing had been really high stress and very volatile. Baker took down Hank's information and talked with Mike's parents for just a few more minutes, and then he nodded to Cass, and they stood to leave. Baker knew he still needed to speak more to the Smitties, but for now, he was going to give them a break, and instead, he and Cass would look into Hank. 2 days later, Baker sat in Cass's office at the Wakefield Police Department, poring over crime scene photos and witness statements. He was starting to get antsy. After meeting with Mike's parents, he'd been excited to speak with Hank Jennings, the disgruntled former employee who also happened to be Mike's cousin. But even though Baker and Cass had sent officers out to track Hank down for an interview, they hadn't been able to get a hold of him yet. However, they had gotten in touch with Mike's wife, Michelle, and had questioned her at her house in Wakefield, but she hadn't given them much. She said that she was at home with her kids at the time of her husband's death, and that she really didn't know of anybody who would want to hurt Mike Jr. Also, Baker and Cass had looked into Allstate Concrete's financial statements, and they had found nothing that suggested there was anything shady or mafia-related happening with the company. Still, Baker knew they were better off than they had been a few days ago, primarily because they had had a chance to review a bunch of the surveillance footage from the businesses around Allstate, and one of those security cameras had been aimed at the street right outside Allstate. Now, this angle didn't show the Allstate parking lot itself, but it did show everyone who entered and exited that parking lot from the street. So, this particular camera had picked up Mike Jr.'s truck arriving at work at 7:39 a.m., and then at 7:44 a.m., so 5 minutes later, an unknown green pickup truck pulled in as well. And then a few minutes after that, Chester Roberts was seen arriving at Allstate on foot. And then at 7:50, the green truck was seen again, leaving the parking lot, 12 minutes before Michael Sr.'s red truck arrived at 8:02. So, whoever the killer was, it looked like they had driven that green truck and had killed Mike and Chester between 7:44 a.m. and 7:50 a.m. The video wasn't clear enough to show the driver of this mysterious green truck or even see its plates, and it didn't actually show the driver of this vehicle, the killer, getting out of the vehicle and entering the building. But knowing the style and color of very likely the killer's vehicle would definitely help them narrow down potential suspects. Just then, the desk phone rang, and Baker watched as Cass grabbed it and said hello. And then Cass got a confused look on his face before he thanked the caller and said they'd be right over. He hung up and told Baker that was Michelle Zametti, and she'd called to say that she had new information to give them, something that she hadn't mentioned in her first interview, and that it was really important. About 15 minutes later, Baker and Cass sat down across from Michelle in her living room for the second time. And to Baker, Michelle seemed very different from the last time they spoke. 2 days ago, she'd seemed horrified and grief-stricken. But now, she just seemed really nervous. She kept touching her hair and fiddling with the stack of condolence cards on the coffee table. Baker commented that there were a lot of cards, and Michelle just nodded. She said so many people had reached out and sent cards, all their friends and neighbors in Wakefield and in Freedom, New Hampshire, where their second home was. And then Michelle took a breath and just got straight to the reason that she had called them. She said that she had withheld information about one of her neighbors in Freedom. His name was Sean Fitzpatrick, and she'd had an affair with him. Baker cleared his throat in surprise and then asked her to go on. Michelle's eyes filled with tears as she explained how Mike Jr. worked so much and she and the kids spent a lot of time at their lake house, and so that meant they spent a lot of time with Sean. And eventually this friendship between Michelle and Sean had grown into a romance. Baker couldn't believe he was hearing this. A secret love triangle gave both Sean and Michelle plenty of motivation to want Mike dead. But before he could ask any follow-up questions, Michelle said her husband actually knew all about her affair and that they had been in therapy and they'd begun to completely turn their marriage around. So finally, a month ago, she'd officially totally broken things off with Sean, and Sean had been really upset about it. Baker shared a look with Cass and could tell they were both thinking the same thing. Obviously, they needed to speak to Sean immediately. But also, Michelle was now back to being a primary suspect too. Maybe she had wanted her husband out of the picture so she could be with Sean, and maybe the only reason she was telling them this was to get ahead of it. However, they would need a lot more evidence before they could prove any of that. So for now, Baker just got Sean's number and address from Michelle and told her they would be in touch. Later that night, Baker and Cass were once again inside of Cass's office, but this time they were there with another officer who was there to give them a crucial update. After speaking with Michelle, Baker had sent a team of officers up to Freedom, New Hampshire to speak with Sean, the neighbor she had been having an affair with. And now, one of those officers was back in Wakefield to tell them what he had learned. And the first thing Baker wanted to know was not about their conversation. It was just, did you see a green truck in Sean's driveway? But the officer shook his head and said Sean did own a truck, but it was bright red. Then he went on to say that when they had spoken to Sean, he had completely denied having an affair with Michelle. Sean had admitted that he had dated a lot of girls, but he'd insisted that he and Michelle were just close family friends. Now, the officers who were there speaking to Sean just stood there and let Sean talk, never telling him that they already knew that Michelle fully admitted to them having an affair, and they knew Sean was lying here. Baker almost laughed when he heard this, because he did not believe Sean at all. And if he was lying like he appeared to be, that made him seem pretty guilty. But before he could say so, the officer added one more thing. He said Sean actually had a solid alibi. He'd been at home on the morning of the murders, and one of his neighbors had actually confirmed it. This particular neighbor took her morning walk every day at 9 a.m., and she'd seen Sean outside his house right around then. Baker sighed. It took around 2 hours to drive between Freedom and Wakefield, so Sean would not have had enough time to kill Mike and Chester by 7:50 a.m. and then get to Freedom by 9. And so suddenly, Sean Fitzpatrick felt like another very promising dead end. On March 18th, so 5 days after the murders of Mike Zimetti and Chester Roberts, Detectives Baker and Cass stood at the back of a church in Wakefield, Massachusetts. They were there for Mike's funeral, and the church was absolutely packed. But the investigators were not just there to pay their respects. They were also there to speak to Hank Jennings, the cousin of Mike who had filed that lawsuit against the concrete company. Since by that point they still had not been able to officially get a hold of Hank, Cass had suggested that they just corner him at Mike's funeral, which he was very likely to attend because, despite his rift with the Zimettis, he was still family. And when the service wrapped up and everybody stood to leave, Baker felt a nudge on his arm. Cass leaned over and whispered that they'd been right, and he pointed out Hank right in the crowd. So, as the attendees started filing out of the church, the investigators pushed their way over to Hank and got in front of him just before he could step outside. Baker immediately noticed that Hank's whole body went tense when they blocked his way, like he wanted to try to make a run for it. So Baker just cut to the chase, and he said, "Hank, will you come with us and speak to us, please?" And Hank's eyes got really wide, and he just said, "No way, not without his lawyer." Then he pushed past the investigators and hurried outside. Baker and Cass didn't follow him. Instead, they just exchanged a look, because they knew now that Hank was obviously their primary suspect. 5 weeks after the funeral, In mid-April of 2006, State Trooper Kevin Baker sat in Detective Cass's office in the Wakefield Police Department. He was wearing gloves, and he was holding a piece of paper that looked like an old-fashioned ransom note. It was covered in letters that had been clearly cut out of a newspaper, and it spelled out a very alarming message. Close business now, or more family will die. This message had been brought to them by Mike Jr.'s mother, Pat, who said they had received it in the mail that morning. For the Zemedis, for so many reasons, this letter was terrifying. It was not just a reminder of their son's murder, but also a promise that there would be more violence. But for Baker, the note was a lead, which they really needed, because it had been over a month since Michael and Chester were killed, and at this point, the two investigators had managed to rule out basically every one of their suspects, and that included Hank Jennings. They'd learned that Hank's clear reluctance to meet with them was not because of guilt. It was because he had signed a non-disclosure agreement during the settlement with the Zemedis and didn't want to break it.
This whole situation is heavy. Pushing on a door only to realize there's a person lying on the other side is truly so awful. I pity that Michael Sr. having to witness that very first event in the morning. Then you spot that green truck on the security camera. It pulls in and leaves in less than 10 minutes. It's such a tight window for a crime so planned out. That part with the ransom notes, with the newspaper letters, is just so cold. The entire case makes the threat feels way more personal. These people were being hunted and they didn't even know until it was too late for them. And that's it for today. If you like this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and maybe comment down below which story was your favorite. You can click on this next video and I'll see you later. Goodbye.